Okay, I think we can start. I'm very excited for tonight's discussion, to be honest. Non-transferable tokens, reputation systems in DAOs are something that will change the ball game, in my opinion. I'm Taki Sol, by the way, speaking from the Grape account. And I think it is very exciting and new ground that we will be looking forward to work towards. Changing the game in terms of how you can build an online reputation on your DAO is a fascinating way, in my opinion, that we can change the reigning plutocracy, let's say, that we have till today in DAOs, which means that a predominant whale can always purchase an X amount of tokens, governance tokens, and enforce their decisions in each DAO. So having a new way to tackle this and in a more fair way that gives people the voice given through their actions and their attestations. This is a word I believe we're going to be hearing a lot tonight. In my opinion, it's very exciting. And speaking of current events, it would have been very interesting to see how the whole Solent situation would have unfolded if we had reputation systems in place and entities or SPTs or whatever you want to call it. So I would really like to hear everyone's opinion about SPTs and entities, and looking forward to hear about what Lighthouse has in store.
Hey, thanks. Maybe I should start. I'm Daniel Kelleher. I'm a VP of Engineering at Civic, and we've built a tokenized identity equivalent, kind of non-transferable token system on Solana, which is integrated into a few of your favorite DeFi protocols. Currently almost in mainnet in Realms as well. For me, the concept, the subject of transferable identity tokens, SPTs, whatever you want to call them, is a really important one, particularly now as we move into the kind of the era where crypto is not just something that techies play with, but more part of the mainstream. The idea of having a Web3 presence is becoming more of a thing that makes sense. And people are kind of building these standards or coming up with ideas of what should be tokenized compared to what should be private and off-chain. And I think there are four components right now. The way I see it, there are four components to a good identity token or SPT. The first is privacy. The second is interoperability. The third is decentralization. And the fourth is composability. I think maybe we can go into those a little bit more in detail later, but I think those four things, if you have that in a token, then you're in a very good position. And I would recommend any protocol integrating this sort of model to try and seek out those four things in any tokenized identity model that they bring in.
Yeah, hello, this is Sebastian Bor, an engineer from Solana Labs working on SPL governance and Realms. And yeah, I agree with Daniel that if you want to talk about reputation score, we have to solve the problem of identity, because that's inherently, I see this like the same problem space where if we can solve the problem of identity, on-chain identity, then we can assign the score, because it has to be non-transferable from the individual point of view, because yes, we can assign to a wallet, but then it can be a problem. You can lose your wallet, and then we have to make sure you cannot lose your reputation, and this is why this, like, from the technical point of view, is inherently important and connected. And yeah, I agree that the reputation, the idea of measuring and scoring reputation is very important, and especially when we are talking about the on-chain governance. I think it's very clearly visible that we cannot just rely on one source of governance power. I think that's fair. That if you invest heavily in a protocol, Solent, Mango, that you should have a say in that protocol. But clearly, that shouldn't be the only source of governance power, and we have to think about something else. So if you contribute to the protocol and you are not necessarily a whale, then you should also be able to govern it, and that's really important.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's certainly an interesting. The most recent Stolend discussion has promoted a bunch of very interesting discussions on how much power do you want to give to just pure plutocratic monetary power. Obviously, I think that it's fair to say, as you said, that if somebody who has more skin in the game has a higher voting power, but any voting system that you choose naturally kind of has an effect on what ends up. It has a game theory like effect on how the DAO is run, be it a DeFi DAO or any other kind of DAO. And so this is where I think reputation becomes a very interesting subject. If you combine, for example, one of the pillars I mentioned earlier was composability, right? If you combine maybe a reputation score with a robust proof of humanity, then you can reliably set up a quadratic voting model or some other similar model based on a composition of those two things. And actually, once you start to have identity tokens that each of them individually represent maybe a different aspect of your personality or a different aspect of your identity, then you can compose them in a myriad different ways. Of course, that leads to questions of another pillar that I mentioned earlier, which is privacy, which we can go into as well.
I would be very curious to understand how interoperability would work across all protocols. Is this something that Civic achieves through its protocol, through its functions?
Well, we actually have we're working on something that's quite early right now, which we're calling derived passes. So this will actually solve a few of these problems. It will also potentially solve the composability problem. But what the idea is to allow the conversion of different token types. So we have something called Civic Pass, right? It's an NTT that is basically allows you gates access to certain protocols. But we want to be able to convert these into NFTs, for example, or convert the possession of an NFT into a Civic Pass, or convert a Lighthouse reputation token into a Civic Pass, or something like that. So having that kind of protocol on chain that is able to literally do these conversions, particularly between different types of NTT, will help a lot with interoperability, because you can just then, in the Solana world, you can just tack on a convert instruction onto whatever else it is you're doing in that particular transaction in order to make that conversion and achieve that interoperability. The other aspect of interoperability is across different chains, of course, and the ability to, for example, have your identity on, for example, Ethereum, where you may have gone to particular trouble to establish a reputation in a DAO, and have that reputation or have that identity transferable to Solana, for example, and we have a cross-chain identity mechanism that supports that as well.
Actually, I also like the concept of the transferability of your reputation score, because I think it's kind of obvious if you do really good job in one DAO and in another one, and then I think it's very unlikely that you are going to do something wrong when you join the third one. And I think that that can revolutionize the concept of hiring people, because I think everybody agree that the way we hire people is really it's really not really good. And I personally find it's almost like a lottery. At the end of the day, it's like no matter how much effort I put into trying to interview candidates, it's at the end of the day, it's just a toss of a coin. But really, the only way I found way to hire people is to, if I know something about them, if I know the projects they worked before, and if I can get that background, that I think improves the chances of hiring the right person is immense. And the fact that if we could capture your experience in some score that can be transferred from chain to chain and from DAO to DAO, that I think that would be amazing. And we know that one of the problems like every DAO faces is how to actually source the talent, how to get the good people to work on you. And I've been quite often, I think it's kind of a little bit better in Web3, because you can just join the DAO, start doing good job, and that's what we call the proof of work, and quite often is sufficient. But still, I think that we can disrupt the whole industry of headhunters, and finding jobs is kind of interesting from that angle as well.
Sebastian, I think you're touching on a point that's really, really interesting, which is that the most important part about the whole reputation idea, at least in a blockchain context, is being able to read someone's history, which kind of brings into question whether or not you actually need a token in order to facilitate this. In fact, at Athens now, I think even Daniel, you asked, or you brought up this point that should DAOs or communities be allowed, or should they have the ability to be able to not issue a token and still log reputation, which kind of takes us to the whole point of like, what is an attestation? So logging something on chain so others can read it. And I think that ultimately that's really the most important aspect of reputation. When we talk about reputation, it's not necessarily the token itself, at least a reputation token.
Yeah, so for people who aren't maybe as deep into the current discussion on this topic, SPTs and so on, as you and I, Patrick, maybe we should just kind of mention. So there's this kind of dichotomy right now between whether you tokenize something or not, right? Whether you put something on chain, or whether you just send around what's called verifiable credentials, and then have those verifiable credentials be evaluated by someone off chain. There's a lot of benefits to that, because in general, when something's on chain, it's obviously not private. So you have to be very careful about what you put on chain. And let's say you combine a lot of different, even if you think you're being extremely careful about what you place on chain, we have a DeFi protocol, for example, with Serum that only works if you're not in OFAC sanctioned countries and United States, right? You can't be in the United States and you can't be in OFAC sanctioned countries. Let's say you have another DeFi protocol which lets you be in the United States but doesn't let you be in an OFAC sanctioned country, and you have a token for one and not the other, then suddenly it's giving people a fairly good idea that you're in the United States, for example. So tokenization of even very large and broad properties of your identity can become problematic very quickly. The way we kind of bridge that gap is our system is based on verifiable credentials. And we basically don't put anything on chain except for the absolute bare minimum that needs to be put on chain. And if you're sending information, if a third party needs access to that information, the information behind the token, so to speak, then they need to request the verifiable credential directly from the holder of the credential. I think that reputation, I'd definitely like to hear more from you, Patrick, about your opinion on whether reputation should be encoded in a token, or whether it should be something closer to a verifiable credential or something completely different.
I think that what's been interesting about exploring the reputation space is that there are many different points of views on this. I think some of them, it really depends on the nature of reputation at its source. So the way we're trying to approach it is to not necessarily make a decision about whether attestation data, so verifiable credentials, can live on chain or should live on chain, but rather give the users of the system the ability to define how that data is stored. So we're exploring a bunch of different options, from storing data off chain and just putting a hash on chain so that people can see that this actually happened, to putting all the data on chain, to using zero knowledge, to tokenizing and not tokenizing, which is kind of another axis of reputation. So we're thinking about this more holistically and thinking that different types of reputation might require different types of storage and access and permissions and things like that. And really, like, that's the game that reputation, that's the game we're playing right now. Anyone can issue a non-transferable token, right? It's sort of, what is the underlying meaning? What are the permissions associated with the data of the underlying meaning? Who has access to it? For example, if I issue a verifiable credential, should I have the ability to reveal that verifiable credential, or is the recipient the one who should have that ability, or should it be some mechanism of governance between those two parties?
Right, exactly. And there was just one thing that I found interesting in what you just, there were lots of things I found interested in what you just said, but one thing I just wanted to raise was the idea that anyone can issue a non-transferable token. And that's true, and that comes back to the question of trust as well. One of the features of the protocol that we've been building is the idea that there's a kind of a network of issuers. So we bootstrap it. We are the kind of first issuer, so to speak, in the network, but it's open to allow other issuers of the same type of token in our case to be part of the network as well. And if you have two issuers, let's say that Lighthouse and Civic were both in the same network, then to the outside world, and particularly to the protocol, the smart contract or the program that is consuming the token, again, in our case, a token, to the outside world, those two issuers, Lighthouse and Civic, would basically look the same. And the benefit of that is that you don't really have to trust a particular issuer, like you might have to do if you have an NFT gated protocol. You have to trust that the NFT is from a particular collection, and sure, that collection might be controlled by a multi-sig, but it's still a single address. Instead, you trust that it comes from a particular network, and then you can have, for example, a DAO that governs who gets to be in that network. And I think those sort of patterns to bridge the, frankly, very difficult to bridge Web 2 to Web 3 boundary when it comes to verifying real world identity or any kind of reputation is a good pattern. Finding a seam so that the smart contracts and the protocols on one side of the seam don't have to be forced to trust any one individual key or any one individual organization on the other side of the seam.
Yeah, I think definitely from a point of view of on-chain governance, at the end of the day, we need a number. I think no matter how that number gets on chain, whether we call this non-transferable token or like in case of Civic, the Civic Pass, I think we need that on chain, and because we have to calculate a mathematical score for your governance power,
right?
And then the question is really who owns that score, and that's very critical, because technically speaking, if it's not secure, and I would say not owned probably by the DAO to some extent, or some trusted third party, or maybe like in the sense trust in the decentralized way, then there's huge risk, because if you can game the system that is used for governance, then you can take over the DAO, and then you can execute a governance attack.
Yeah, exactly. And to be honest, if privacy weren't an issue, right? If you could just tokenize all the things, if you could basically find a way to turn every single activity or every single off-chain identity property into a token, then you could solve that problem largely with composability, right? Then it's not the case that the DAO receives a score. More, the DAO provides a function that turns all those various tokens into a score. So you've been active on this many DAOs, and you've contributed to this many proposals. You've behaved a certain way on Discord or whatever it is. All of those things turn into tokens, and then you pass them through this function, and out spits a number. And that for me would be the ideal case. The other side of the coin, right on the other end, would be, I presume, that the users themselves, or the contributors themselves, the participants themselves, are somehow in control of that score, and that would be an example of the gaming, the governance mechanism that you said. In the absence of that, in the absence of a world where privacy doesn't matter, we need to make sure that privacy is absolutely forefront when it comes to things like DAOs. They need a trusted third party that can distill that data from the privately into a score, and the DAO needs to be able to choose between potential different third parties, and needs to be able to trust that third party and change it as needs be. So that kind of layer, this network layer between the users and the DAO itself, I think, is vital there.
What about the approach of each DAO issuing their own SPTs, entities in the form of a token or an NFT, and each DAO decides the governance power that they assign on the certain levels, if they have any, or if they establish any in these entities for the governance of the particular individual? Because is it our goal to enable people within each DAO separately to have their own governance power based on their reputation and achievements and contributions? Or are we looking for this to be transferable to other DAOs? So, for instance, a person that has done immense contributions and work on a DAO, do they get a certain degree of governance power by entering another DAO? How do we tackle this one in the way that we're discussing right now?
I think that there are different ways of sort of like interpreting a score or valuing reputation. The way that we're approaching it is that reputation needs context. So the context in this case would be the community that's issuing reputation. So it would be each DAO sort of has its own token or reputation system, but that reputation is composable. So if you earn reputation from other communities or DAOs, then in some way you can evaluate reputation across projects. I think that the big question is, if different DAOs are giving different scores for different work, then how do you normalize those scores to get a coherent single number that is an accurate representation of someone's global reputation? And there are different ways of going about that. For example, normalizing the scale on which scores are attributed, but then that brings into brings into play the quality of the work that's being done and the ability to evaluate that outside of the DAO's own ecosystem. I think that it's the approach we're taking is really is DAO centric. And to tie this into Daniel's point, what's kind of interesting about that is that a DAO or the members of a DAO can kind of choose how they would like their reputation to be stored, to be saved, like on chain or off chain, which increases or reduces the visibility on the reputation that's been earned by particular members. What's interesting about that is the more public you make it, the more likely you make it so that your members can be quote unquote poached or marketed to. And the more private you make it, the more that reputation is more relevant inside of the DAO and less relevant outside of the DAO. And I think that DAOs and communities and members of those communities should be able to choose to what extent they would like to have their reputation be visible inside or outside of the DAO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharan. I'm a co-founder with Patrick on Lighthouse. I think all of these conversations are really interesting because we get into this space of how do you really value the contributions that are made by different people in different categories of contribution, whether that's like development or marketing or something else. I think fundamentally the way that we look at it is that what is reputation based on? So reputation is based on some kind of activity, and that's what attestations is all about. So the idea is that anyone can come in and submit the contribution that they have made, and then that forms some kind of a contribution stream where then the decentralized community can elect maybe stewards who then govern that and then say, okay, based on this contribution, we think that this deserves X amount of points or scores or something like that. And one of the things that we've tried to look at is, okay, if you're going to score someone, what are the different metrics that you look at evaluating in order to arrive at a score? And some of the things that we're experimenting is with things like, can you look at like the importance of a task, the complexity of it, the quality of it, and based on that, can you form some kind of a score? And can you also help the person who's attesting by giving him information like similar contributions that have been attested a certain way in order to help him arrive at a score that he thinks is comparable with the other contributions that have been made. And then the way that we're thinking about it is that once you have these scores can be, they're ultimately a meta representation of value created within a community. So these scores can be represented in multiple formats. So whether it's a non-transferable token that you use in like a multi-token model for governance, or whether it's like a evolving reputation NFT or a goal-based NFT badge that's used for social signaling, or whether it's like token streams or token payments that are done for contributions. All of these are possible when you are able to come up with that score and then design apps on top of these, and then use those to activate and expand your decentralized community.
That's very interesting. How are you considering the scenarios when you can revoke somebody's reputation? Like, for example, like two cases when you want to change it. So one case is, for some reason somebody does bad thing and then you want to revoke it. And another is when like the impact of the contribution has changed. Because sometimes you can do something and people might not just understand the impact, and that might take months or years really for like fully understand that was like really significant contribution, which was not like that at the beginning. What's your thinking about that?
So there are if I was to kind of unpack that a little bit, there are two questions there. The first question is about revoking these scores that have been attested to someone. One of the mechanisms to do it is to kind of like facilitate some kind of a burn function. So what we're doing today, for example, with the issuance of NTTs, is that when someone signs a consent form to receive NTTs, he also delegates the ability to control those entities onto a smart contract. And through that mechanism, we implement like a burn function where the contract controls that. The other question that was raised was about the value of a contribution changing over time and people not realizing that. I think the answer to that is that we see these scores as being inflationary. So what's really cool is that you may value a certain task a certain way, but later on in time, if you value it in a different way, someone could request an additional attestation for that, and you could issue an additional amount of points for that, or a score for that that accurately reflects the value it has created at that point in time. By making it inflationary like this, there is also another interesting side effect, which is that generally what happens is that early on you distribute scores maybe to a small community and there are very active participants, but given the complexity of coordination within a DAO, sometimes these participants become less active as time goes on. And by having these tokens being inflationary, what happens is that naturally someone exceeds in reputation than someone else. And how you can value all of these and put it onto a scale is by having some kind of a percentile where you're able to say overall how much of points a certain person has received relative to all of the contribution that has been given to a community. And that again is relative to that particular community. And the way we are thinking about it is to also expose all of this information through APIs. And we're trying to use ZK snarks to give some kind of data privacy on top of it, so that communities can decide how they want to store their reputation. And we're still exploring that avenue. But fundamentally, what that means is that, for example, in the future, if you want to read reputation that's tagged a certain way from multiple communities, and you want to use that to create, let's say, some kind of a comparable score, you can then create these kinds of functionalities that takes the contribution made in multiple DAOs into account, even though within those DAOs the point systems are very different.
Hey, everyone. I don't know if you could hear me. Sharon, very good insight there. And Patrick, Daniel, it's nice hearing from both of you again. Sebastian, thank you for everything you've done in governance. My question goes first to Daniel. And the next one goes, of course, it's going to be the same to Patrick. It's going to sound silly, but I just want to ask it like I'm 5. These are non-transferable tokens, technically, that we've discussed, but do you think maybe there's the possibility that sometimes you might need to move wallets and you would need access to that? I mean, maybe I'm saying something silly, but I think our audience also might have that question too.
No, it's a very good question. Yes, absolutely. Any system that's integrated must not require the user to stick to one single wallet. For obvious security reasons, it's not just in DAOs, but in NFTs as well. If you are presenting an NFT to gain access to a party or something like that, you don't want to be carrying around your ledger. You don't want to have to sign with your ledger or your cold wallet every time you want to vote in a DAO, right? These are when you think about it, fairly obvious. So, but that requires some infrastructure that doesn't exist yet, at least not in a I would say a generic way. There's definitely been work done. Sebastian has put a lot of work in, along with other people in the governance community on Solana in vote delegation, for example, and that's a really important step. What we're building in Civic is the ability to link multiple wallets together to a single identity. So our identity is what's called a decentralized identifier. It lives on Solana. In fact, we're quite proud of the fact that the Solana implementation of decentralized identifiers is one of the best implementations of decentralized identifiers, and I think it will lead in the future to Solana being a really attractive chain for identity-based Web3 products in the future. Basically, the way it works is you connect multiple wallets together and you prove ownership of them by signing a transaction with each of them, and that basically tokenizes that relationship so that when you vote with Hot Wallet, it can verify, for example, the reputation token that is attached to the cold wallet and chain those together. And the idea is that the same infrastructure that supports that in DAOs would also support the gaining access to a party and an NFT or any myriad other protocol-based requirements.
No, that's incredible to hear, and I think that would answer a lot of questions that communities would have in general of the transferability. What about with regards to Civic, of course, proof of identity, you have to be an actual individual there. So you have to prove that you're probably, let's say, on Curve, as we would say it, and not a program account. But technically, you might want to use a multi-sig as an individual. Would that be also supported, or should I say that's not something that is even in the thought process?
Oh, it's definitely in the thought process, and again, it kind of ties in. So I guess one of the important factors there, when we're talking about, say, the proof of humanity or proof of uniqueness, is that you cannot, if you have attached, let's say, this token to a single wallet and then linked that single wallet with multiple identities, that only one of those can be active at one time, so to speak. So, for example, in a NFT mint, we have customers that say, okay, we want to ensure that only one NFT is issued to an individual person. So we have this idea of deriving a new token from that uniqueness token that can only be used once in an individual mint, and it's the mint that decides to do that. And there's a similar pattern I can imagine happening in the DAO, where you don't kind of refer to the direct pass or the direct token, but you refer to a derivative of that, and that derivative some way links that identity to the DAO such that you can't link that identity to the DAO again with another wallet. Patterns like that are what we're working on.
I think Daniel's solution is perhaps the most elegant one. And I think that the word non-transferable token in some way is a little bit misleading, at least our interpretation of it. And that's maybe why the word soulbound token really kind of describes this better, even though it's, in my opinion, maybe not the nicest way of describing it. It's that in the way we conceive non-transferable tokens, it's that they still need to be somewhat transferable. So they're somewhat transferable tokens. If you don't have a system like the one Daniel's describing, you may be able to rely on this idea that reputation is the result of of an interaction between two parties, and so a user should be able to lobby the issuer of that reputation or that score to be able to transfer it to another wallet. And so that's sort of like building on what Sharon was saying about burning tokens. It's just an extension of that. So if you agree that a DAO is able to burn your tokens for bad behavior for whatever reason, then that DAO can also reissue tokens after it's burnt your tokens and say transfer them to a new wallet. And that's the way that we're at least thinking about the idea of transferability in a non-transferable token world.
Yeah, but I also agree with that. But with what Sharon said, he said the inflationary, so it's like a decay, which is very interesting because you definitely want to have that factor in of the decay. You don't want people that participated in the beginning to also have the same reputation when they've stopped participating at all, if not more than other people that are participating. So that would be extremely interesting to have that decay or the inflationary portion of it, so that as time goes by, either the people that are gaining reputation have more, or the person that had the reputation is just having less or the same, but with less purchasing power. Or let me just phrase it, less voting power.
Yeah, totally. I think those ideas are pretty compatible. Like if you will get inflated out of your reputation if you stop contributing to a DAO, if you use the Lighthouse system. If you're reissued reputation in the future, then that reissuance of reputation can be valued either relative to the past reputation, proportional reputation distribution, or the current one, or some future one. It kind of gives an ability as well to revalue reputation and determine how much weight it should have in the current context. That's why the system is really cool. It's because you can really you're never stuck. There's always a way out, and there's always a way to change it, even though on its face it looks like somewhat permanent because of the non-transferability of the tokens.
Just very quickly, another interesting trait that I would like to highlight is this idea of flavored reputation. So the way that we see it is that reputation, of course, means different things to different communities. And even within a community, if you look at how DAOs are organized as sub-DAOs that perform different critical functions for a DAO, we think that reputation also can have different flavors, like the way you'd want to evaluate, let's say, a design task could be very different to the way you want to evaluate an engineering task. And the engineering task evaluation could be relative to other engineers within a community. It could be voted upon by someone who has a lot of experience in that field, who's an active contributor to the DAO, whereas a design task may have a completely different interpretation of reputation. So by giving the ability to tag attestations or tag work that people have done and then build some kind of a scoring mechanism on top of it, one of the things that you can do is you can transparently query the data on chain and then see how different reputation scores have been formed even within a DAO. And it's not just one monolithic score that just represents, well, it could be a monolithic score that represents your affinity or proximity to a DAO. But what it also could be is that within that DAO, you have different people with different areas of expertise which is kind of like how reputation works in the real world.
So when we're actually talking about attaching a value to reputation, just I'm curious, Kirk, how are you thinking about, for example, Grape? What portion of governance power, comparing to the reputation base, you should get from the reputation versus the Grape token that you can go and buy? I think, do you have any thoughts about how you want to combine these two?
So it's interesting when we thought about. So there are two aspects to that. The first aspect is how do you come up with an accurate point score that reflects the different criteria for how to value a certain task. We are exploring different ways of reviewing a contribution in terms of, like I mentioned before, looking at like the complexity, the importance of a task, and the quality of a task, and then looking at whether we can somewhat semi-standardize this and then algorithmically create a score out of it for that particular task, and then that forms the numerical value of reputation that's attached, or the score that's attached to a particular piece of work or piece of contribution that has been done. In terms of tying this in with native token governance, one of the big issues that we see today with native token governance is that it favors like whale-like behavior very heavily, right? And that was something that was spoken about. And one of the mechanisms that we are evaluating is, can you have like a two-token model where you decouple, let's say, contribution or governance power purely from a financial token, and you attach part of it onto this, let's say, non-transferable token that's created in a way where the sum of power created by both of these tokens form your overall reputation power, or the entity token that you hold in some way amplifies the power that's created by the amount of financial tokens that you hold. Because ultimately, in a DAO, I mean, there is a financial aspect to it, and there are people who are incentivized because of the financial elements to it. But what you don't want to have is someone who's just purely having a lot of governance power just purely because they're very wealthy. So how we try and look at it is that financial power matters. So because of that, having a financial token and having some reputation, I mean, having some governance power attached to that matters. But by also attaching governance power to contributions and then using that to amplify the value that's created through holding native tokens, kind of balances the system out a little bit, and kind of makes DAOs what they were supposed to be, which is these decentralized organizations where value is distributed to the entire community, not just a few people who are extremely wealthy.
Yeah, but actually, that was my question. How do you see the percentages? I'm just curious. If do you have any thoughts, like how much my governance power should be coming from the governance token with the economic value that I can buy as a whale, and versus the score that I can gain through working hard for the DAO? Should they be like equal? I mean, I'm just curious. Do you have any thoughts about what the mix of those scores should be? Like, for example, can the wealthiest whale is going to be always have more importance and more governance power than the person who has the highest reputation score in the DAO, or how to balance these two?
I think one way to approach this and thinking this from an everyday perspective in DAO to DAO affairs, DAO to DAO affairs, is that first you might need to introduce a time factor in this, so that let's say that a whale that comes in and sweeps a large amount of tokens and without the time aspect has now immense power and can steer things to whichever direction they like. And one other thing that I'm thinking is that you could approach things as contributors achieving milestones that would not be achievable by, let's say, a whale in the form of purchasing tokens. So certain milestones should be valued very, very, very heavily in terms of the governance power that you gain as a reputation token governance version of the governance token.
Okay,
So
that's interesting. So, I don't know. Are you saying that you should actually work towards gaining your governance rights even against your governance token? So let's say I have like million grape or mango, and I don't get like the full governance power from that. I have to work towards actually unlocking all that potential.
I think if the only thing that you do is accumulate governance through buying a token from the market, should not be the way that you achieve the ultimate governance power, because that doesn't prove that you care about the DAO. It only proves that you care to accumulate the governance token, and we don't know what motives lie behind it. So if you can identify the motives and recognize the contribution and give more power to the contribution instead of the financial power that one may easily have or acquire down the road, I think this is more powerful and in the best interest of the community, to slowly find a way to give more governance power to people that contribute rather than the people that can buy it straight away.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, I like that.
One other thing is that, you know what, there's always, in this idea, there's always a path to buy it. What if you locked it? And I think there, it gives you a good layer that you could work as a base. These are the people that have locked, maybe for a certain period of time, and this is how much they're going to be able to vote. And if you bought it, you don't have the ability to vote. Maybe not to the same extent or weight, but I think there could be a differentiation there, because buying from the market could definitely rig the system.
But that's actually kind of the opposite of what the vested token escrow does, because you lock tokens to gain more governance power, which means you can buy it and then immediately lock for a long time, and then that's your governance power. But now we can actually could reverse it and say, yes, you can buy the tokens, but then the time has to pass, and then maybe you have to gain some reputation score to actually claim that power that you bought it. So that's kind of reverse almost of what everybody else is doing. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it just to throw it out there, but I was thinking of different ideas of what can and how can people use what they have to buy a token and then lock it. And although they've locked it for a period of time, they're also trying to manipulate or game the system. Also, another thing to take into consideration is what do you do with flash loans in that scenario that people are getting the token on a loan and they don't even have the purchasing ability to get the full token. These are things that are going to happen eventually, where people want to disrupt maybe an ecosystem that exists. So there are a lot of questions to be asked there on how do you protect the DAO, and also how does the community also take responsibility for shielding bad actors in the process.
Yeah, I think that's why valuing reputation, as mentioned, is a really interesting way of solving for this, because if you look at vote escrow tokens, what has happened with them is that usually what happens is that someone else then creates a representation of a vote escrow, and then you can buy that in the open market, and then you can use that to claim those vote escrow tokens, and then there's a secondary market around that. So I think more than really locking your tokens and gaining higher reputation power, this ability to be able to actually gain reputation for contributing and then using that to value in some way the amount of financial tokens that you hold and amplify or de-amplify that is a really interesting way of solving things. Another thing that I wanted to highlight was that recently on a tweet, I saw that a DAO contributor had mentioned that every time I contribute to the DAO, it gives me native tokens. But these native tokens, in addition to governance power, also has financial utility attached to it. So in order to like eat, I need to sell my governance power. So how does this kind of like help me? And how is this a good system? And I think that in the long run, just the idea of being able to unbundle your financial power from your governance power and have those represented in separate ways would prove to be useful, and we can look at different ways of what the correlation of those are. But fundamentally, at least that way, there is a better representation of community contributors and the contribution that they make, and that's valued.
Maybe just to add to that, what's kind of interesting is we're talking about contexts that are like already exist. So where a DAO has already issued a native token, and that token is held by a lot of different members. And we're talking about how to balance out the governance weight of the native token with another token. So it could be by locking tokens or reputation or any of those mechanisms. I think an interesting case to consider is, let's say you have a new DAO. So there's just a small team, maybe 2 or 3 people that are trying to do a Web3 project. And they don't have a token yet. They haven't issued a token. They don't have investors. They haven't planned on doing an IDO. Reputation tokens might be a great way to bootstrap the governance mechanism without the native token. In which case, over time, the problem that we're talking about becomes somewhat different, because you might begin basing things on reputation rather than on native tokens. Whereas right now we're looking at how to balance out native tokens with reputation. And I think that's like a whole different paradigm to operate in. And I think that might be, if reputation does become, or is as promising as we think it is, then that might be the more prevalent paradigm in like 3, 4, 5 years.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, to me at least, and this is just my personal opinion, but like that's what DAOs were supposed to be. Like when we contribute to open source projects, we do so because we have an affinity to those projects. We like contributing to those projects, and we take like our personal time out in order to be able to contribute to a project and then achieve the committership status, right? I feel like in terms of talking about decentralized communities and all of these contributors who contribute to projects, some active, some passive. What's interesting about this model or this new organizational like philosophy is this idea that everybody gets some say, everybody gets like some vote in the way things are done, and the more involved you are and the more active you are, that's somehow represented in your voice, like in the voice that you have with that particular community, and these kinds of models actually help further those paradigms, as opposed to like one where it's just favoring the whales. Because to me, that's just like taking a traditional organization and just slapping on DAO on top of it because it's just like it's cool. But that's not really what excited me at least about DAOs. So yeah.
There's another aspect to this, though. You have to be able, as a community and as a DAO, even from the early beginning, to separate noise from actual contribution, because a lot of activity does not always equal a contribution. And this is another phase of DAOs and decentralized communities, that there's a pitfall that you may easily fall into, where you're trying to listen to all the voices, and there are a lot of voices, and this forces the community into a stall and inertia, because extreme scrutinization and activity without milestones that the community should be setting from the get-go is very important. Otherwise, you can get things can get lost in noise and meaningless activity without moving the needle forward. This is a very, very delicate balance to keep, especially in the early days of the community, where everyone's trying to find their voice and how they can contribute. So milestones, I think, are very important to be set up from the get-go.
actually have a question relating to that. As a relative newbie to the world of DAOs, I remember when I was looking into DAO reputation models on Ethereum, hearing about the idea that basically, an individual that has themselves amassed a lot of reputation is then able to transfer more reputation as a reward for work done to others than some of them might. It was something along those lines. I don't remember the details, and I don't remember the platform that did it. But the idea that reputation is basically amassed and then handed out almost like water collecting into a bowl and then coming out again. It's almost got its a strength of its own. Is that what you're talking about when you talk about this kind of direction that a DAO pulls in, or is it much more kind of, I guess, for want of a better word, centralized in the council or the kind of founders or whatever you want to call them?
It's a fact that we do start from a centralized standpoint. The main founders, let's say the first contributors and all that. It's up there to these people to move and set a framework for decentralization as fast as possible, and as fast as possible as the community can afford to do that, because the community may not always be at the right point at the right time. So this is something that needs to be carefully be evaluated from the start, and certain milestones and ways that you reward reputation are set from the very beginning, and are defined from the very beginning. That's the tricky part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's always, as with a lot of these things in Web3, it's all a question of, we're building new framework. DeFi is a perfect example, right? Nobody, when they set up Solend, was expecting the events of this week to happen, and they probably, even if they were expecting it, had very clear ideas of how they would go about dealing with it that probably aren't the same as the way that they have done. If you're building a new model with its own dynamics, just chaos theory will tell you that you can't predict how it's all going to pan out. So you need to make sure there's handbrakes and checks while maintaining the spirit of the DAO and making sure that people feel that they are rewarded for contribution, that they're able to actually play a part in steering it. So I think that because the reputation token is effectively the currency that's used to define those dynamics, I think it's going to have to be something very robust and also flexible to allow those sorts of models to be integrated without giving up too much control and giving up too much basically kind of succumbing to the chaos, so to speak.
That's a really interesting point, Daniel. I think there's a couple of cases that, using Ethereum as using Ethereum's history as kind of a backdrop for all of this is quite interesting, because they have quite a lot of experience doing reputation in a whole bunch of different ways. In some cases, like we've been speaking with DXDAO, for example, what they've done is they've capped the amount of reputation you can earn at 4% of all reputation. So you can never exceed that, which means you'll never have outsized reputation and can never engage in some like collusive behavior that's reputation driven. And then there are other cases like Coordinape, which is where different people get attributed tokens and they can distribute those tokens to their peers. And at the end of a season, so every time you do these token distributions, the result is how a bounty or a reward amount would be distributed proportionally amongst those people that gave each other tokens. And that's quite interesting because they try and apply some limits through this seasons mechanism rather than having this be some sort of a perpetual game that people play. But I think that we're still really, really early in this. And like you say, these systems need to be flexible in order to adjust on the fly. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that experimentation over the next year or so.
Yeah, super interesting. And just on that subject of Ethereum models, and I guess this is a question I have for you guys. How much do you guys see the fact that Solana has a much lower barrier to entry when it comes to DAOs. Voting is cheap. Creating proposals is cheap. How much do you see that influencing the reputation dynamics? I mean, in a way, the high barrier to entry at Ethereum mainnet, at least, is in a way its own reputation gate, because people are going to actually have to contribute, spend gas to vote. And that might, I mean, that already puts a slant on things, is what I'm saying. So how much do Solana DAOs, maybe this is mainly a question for Sebastian, how much do Solana DAOs have to, or what's possible on Solana that's not possible on Ethereum through the low barrier to entry?
That's a good question. I think definitely. I think if understanding your question, are you saying that the higher entry on Ethereum results in like high quality contributions? Is that correct?
Well, that's the optimist view, I suppose. Yeah, but I mean, it also means that you have to strongly care, maybe, or just literally be a whale in order to vote. Whales get disproportionate votes purely based on the gas. It's the difference between a progressive and a regressive tax, right? If you're taxed a percentage, or if you're taxed a fixed amount, sales tax is regressive. So it makes it easier for wealthy people to purchase than it does poorer people. And gas on Ethereum is an equivalent regressive tax.
Yeah, I think that definitely, because of the gas fees that excludes certain population from voting what's entirely. But then also you can argue that that population which is excluded wouldn't have any meaningful impact on the vote anyway, at least if you just consider the economic value. So I would say that the mechanism, I think, probably is going the same. And I think that the fact that the costs are lower on Solana, that definitely should improve participation. But at the same time, I think that fundamentally people don't want to be bothered, and that's the reality. And I think instead of trying to solve the problem of low participation, we really have to solve the problem how to govern with low participation. This is just reframe the problem, and this is we have to take from there. And then what that means, if we think about, okay, we accept the fact that the participation is going to be low, then we can assume that the people who are going to participate are going the ones that who care, right? They can care because of economic value, or because maybe they care about the community, about the protocol. And this is what I actually think, that the reputation idea can actually solve the problem, because it can essentially give more voting power to people who care and who actually want to participate. And then the low fees would allow you to participate in the governance regardless how much you have.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think in Ethereum, when you're actually voting, a lot of the large protocols use tools like Snapshot, where the voting doesn't necessarily happen on chain, or there's a lot of discussion that happens on the forums. And partly why I think that the voter participation is low is not necessarily because that the high gas fees creates a barrier for people to vote. Even though that does have the interesting dynamic that you spoke about, Daniel. I think one of the reasons that people don't vote also is because of they're not, at least this is my assumption, that maybe like they don't feel that their vote is going to have a big impact, or that it counts, or that it will make a difference, or whatever. And so a lot of the long tail gets dropped out. And by introducing this paradigm of like reputation tokens and tokens related to like active contribution, and then valuing that, and not just valuing pure financial activity, I think that then becomes a lot more interesting, because all of a sudden, even if you're not a very large financial player, just because you have an affinity or proximity towards a project, and you have actively worked and contributed in that project, you are given a higher amount of governance power than you traditionally would have had. And so you are more incentivized to actually participate in these kinds of discussions, and you feel part of that community in a much better way.
Yeah, but the thing is that the gas fees on Ethereum would not be bypassed in that way, because even though you might amass a certain amount of reputation, which means that you have power to vote, the fees on Ethereum make this very prohibitive. So you have to be, unless you're a whale or a very wealthy person, you have to be very selective. Even despite the fact that you might have the power, the governance power from the reputation, you might be very selective or not included in many of the voting activities. So I think that's what makes Solana so much more attractive, and the inclusivity. It's something that we will always need to be striving for, because that's the way we're going to be discovering, new minds, new opinions, new community members. That by having a way to putting on chain, ideally the skin in the game factor, that would lead in always improving the quality of members within a community, because the ones that are staying and the ones that are being evaluated in the best way are the ones that are going to, do what's best in the best interest of the community and the ecosystem overall, hopefully.
I 100% agree with that, and I definitely understand the economic point that although that people who might not vote due to the high gas would not have a material influence on the result of the vote, but this idea of feeling included, feeling part of a family, part of the family of the DAO, rather than just working for the DAO, really comes down to whether or not you are able to contribute, like voting and creating proposals. So I think that Solana has a huge benefit in that regard. I mean, people in the developing world would absolutely be scared off by having to pay more than even $1 to cast a vote. That would be basically out of the question. I had one other question again on the subject of reputation, which is I remember somebody talking. Somebody from this group, we were talking recently about how a vote in a kind of traditional political environment wouldn't typically make it to the floor of the House until it was already fairly clear how it was going to go. And that's often the case in DAOs as well, I think. But one thing that's left out in that is the kind of the debate section. And obviously, we have forums where the famous names maybe the founders or the council or whatever announce things and there's debate. But how much does reputation become a factor in the debating section of a DAO, in the discussion section? How much can we move away again from having these kind of anointed leaders into a model where people amass reputation, and their reputation means their voices are automatically heard more clearly? Do you guys, Lighthouse or Grape or whoever, have thoughts around that?
To be totally transparent and honest, it's not something we've considered in a deep way. The closest we've come to talking about that has been it's been basically understanding the models that drive like Reddit or Hacker News, where if you have a lot of karma or points, when you upvote something, it's boosted a lot more than someone who has less karma or points. That's like as far as we've gotten with that so far. But maybe Grape, you guys have, or Kirk, you have some ideas on that?
I'll say this. I can't wait till we integrate Daniel and we integrate Patrick in our entire processes in general, because there's so many different things that we can do on our end. And there's so many things that digest. We have fantastic tools, the governance tools that we're using right now. We've tried a lot of features in the Grape ecosystem, and we're using our voting power to be able to push ideas forward. But my answer is that we're going to explore a lot of options, but having transparency with regards to proof of identity and also another layer of reputation is going to be a huge change with the dynamic of people's voting power and make it more democratic than just the ability to buy in and be able to push decisions one way or another just because you have the ability to buy more votes.
I also think that, again, in the form of a milestone or an achievement, that this might be able to be tackled in the forums, in the debates, in a way that you get rewarded for participating in hot debates, let's say. You get rewarded if you have less reputation and you jump in a conversation with people of greater reputation within the community. So that the initiative that you take and the courage that you take to speak up in hotly debated topics around and discussions around the community, this is a special trait, and we must find a balance and always seek out these individuals that they want to jump in and be part of the conversation, regardless of who the participants are in that conversation and what their reputation or their status within the community is. So I think this might be an interesting way that we should be looking to evaluate, the new voices and the interesting voices that come in and voice their opinion. Because after all, when you're in a DAO, it's your responsibility to voice your opinion. You should not be holding back. It's your responsibility to take initiatives. And the more that you stick to them, the more traction you will gain, I believe, from the greater community, especially if it's in the best interest of the community.
I think that's well said. I mean, I don't want to introduce a whole other aspect of this right now because we've been going for a little while, but this makes me think a lot about the mechanisms. It makes me think about a comparison between employee retention today and the average time someone might spend at a company versus like in a DAO environment. You want to be valued for the contributions you make, and that commitment can be more long term. So I think a lot of people, I mean, what's natural in tech today is to change jobs every so often to get a better salary or to try and bump up your remuneration. But in the context of a DAO, when you're being issued reputation for contributions that you're making, especially early on, it would be interesting to think to what extent you receive reputation for the contributions you're making as an early contributor versus, say, a later and more established one. And I think that might have an influence on a DAO's ability to acquire and retain high quality contributors or good talent, and that as you build reputation into the mechanisms of a DAO and people acquire that over time, there's less incentive to leave because you're becoming a stronger member of that DAO with more influence and governance, with more social credibility, and those have staying power that we don't really see today in the current tech environment. I think that could flip the entire idea of switching jobs every 2 or 3 years on its head.
I think we've gone a long way. We've been at it for more than an hour, almost 90 minutes. So a very fascinating discussion, very interesting opinions, very interesting ideas, concepts that we're very excited to to implement and explore because we're working in uncharted territories here, each and every one of us. So it's always interesting to meet with like-minded people and have a chat about things that excites us the most. So I want to thank you everybody for joining us and voicing your thoughts, your opinions. If we have any questions from the audience, we raise your hands if you want to speak, if you want to ask something. Otherwise, let's call it today, I think, if it's all right with everybody else. Okay. Once again, thank you everybody for joining. It's been a blast. Let's do this again very soon, and looking forward to explore all the fascinating things that we deal in our day-to-day DAO adventures. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Have a good night, and take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
And don't forget to
Take
check
care.
out the New Realms Today page. It looks beautiful.
Here.
You're beautiful. Bravo.
Awesome.